From Blue Springs, Missouri, in my home, welcome back to CIMM Sessions, our little bite-sized servings of theology, culture, and community of Christ, identity, mission, message, beliefs, and practices. I'm David Lloyd, the director for CIMM, the Center for Innovation in Ministry and Mission, through the Graceland and Community of Christ Seminary. Tonight, we are continuing our series, our multi-part series, on Choose Hope. The idea of hope in our church is one that is not only necessary, but also part of the direction that World Conference is going. And what we're doing is going over the adult reunion materials that have just come out from headquarters and sharing them for those of you who might not be able to go to reunion or might be preparing for reunion or might be preparing for World Conference. All of this will be of great help to everyone who participates. This is part 2 in our 5-part series. And tonight, our presenter is Katie Harmon-McLaughlin, and her theme is Breathe in Hope. And so we turn it over to Katie. Welcome, Katie.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. It's so good to see all of your faces tonight or this morning or whatever time zone you are arriving in. I'm going to share my screen. And probably some of you were on with Stacy Cram last week, but if you weren't, I'm going to take just a couple moments here at the beginning to just go over what it is that we're doing for this reunion season and where you can find this resource. So the theme for Reunion 2025 is Choose Hope. And this may be a refresher for some, but that's directly connected to the World Conference theme of Hope is Here. And that was an intentional choice so that after this important formative experience for our worldwide community, we could move into the reunion season and continue to deepen in the themes and ideas that were introduced throughout that week. And so beyond the reunion experience, this is also a great resource for group reflection in your communities and congregations. And I think you'll see that, especially tonight, there's a lot of opportunity for personal reflection as well. So even if you just want to download this resource or purchase a copy of the book and use it for your own personal practice, I think that you'll find it to be sustaining and renewing as we become a people of God's hope. This is where you can find this resource. All of the reunion materials are available on heraldhouse.org. There are classes for all ages, including this adult class that we are exploring in this series, and also worship and sharing service resources. So tonight, we are going to breathe in hope. And tonight is maybe one of the more emotionally challenging beginnings to one of these courses, because as you can see on the screen, we are starting with the universal feeling of hopelessness. We will meet a hope that meets us where and how we are, while also breaking into the present with a vision for God's future. So it may not seem very hopeful to begin in hopelessness, but I hope that this becomes a meaningful way for us to reflect on reality with faith and love. Some of the objectives for tonight's class: we'll practice lament as a way of embracing the feeling of hopelessness in prayer. We'll discover how to live now as if the horizon of God's future was already breaking in among us. And we'll continue to deepen our inner resources for sustaining hope through the practice of contemplative prayer. As Stacy mentioned last week, there are 2 primary voices that are guiding our reflection. One is one of our Community of Christ cloud of witnesses, to borrow a phrase from last week, Jeffrey Spencer. in his book, A Brightness of Hope. And the other is Professor Luther Smith, who wrote a fantastic book called Hope is Here, Spiritual Practices for Justice and Beloved Community. And Luther is a friend of Community of Christ, and he has participated with us in ministry in the past. And so it's really special to be able to use this book that comes from an ecumenical but also deeply connected source. So we're going to start with a quote by Claudio Carvallis and then a story about Claudio Carvallis. He says, "The power of prayer offers resistance to the empire. To orient our hearts, embolden our souls, strengthen our spirits. No empire can resist the work of the Spirit who keeps things alive, shows us ways out of no ways, breaks down barriers and walls, and makes us sing a song of victory and freedom at last." What a powerful statement. Have you ever considered that your prayer might be a resistance to empire, to those dehumanizing, oppressive, destructive forces that occur in the world around us? This is a biblical idea, and this is a contemporary vision and reality. The idea for tonight's class came from some time that members of the Community of Christ Formation Ministries team spent with Claudio Carvallis several years ago. Claudio Carvallis is a Brazilian liberation liturgical theologian. So he focuses on liberation theology as through liturgical expression. And we were talking to him about the idea of hope, and he invited us to pause in our conversation and challenged us and said, "You really can't talk about hope until you have sat in the place of hopelessness. You really can't talk about hope until you have sat in the place of hopelessness. Otherwise, it can become a fantasy, an aspiration, a wish that is disconnected from the realities that many around the world experience on a daily basis." And to connect that to our Christian faith, he says, you can't experience resurrection without experiencing Good Friday and Holy Saturday. And so tonight, we're going to enter at the beginning of our session some of that Good Friday, Holy Saturday experience of our faith. Being with those places in us and in our worlds that we might otherwise avoid or turn away from because it can be difficult to be present in the midst of. From the reunion text, we read, "It is hard to stay here and bear witness to the places of hopelessness in our lives and world. It takes tremendous strength of heart to stay present to what can break us open. How are we to be amid the aching reality of suffering occurring even now? It is into the difficult complexity of these spaces of hopelessness that we hear the prophetic invitation. God, the eternal creator, weeps for the poor, displaced, mistreated, and diseased of the world because of their unnecessary suffering. Such conditions are not God's will. Open your ears to hear the pleading of mothers and fathers in all nations who desperately seek a future of hope for their children. Do not turn away from them, for in their welfare resides your welfare. And so tonight I'm going to invite us to spend a few moments of personal reflection. This will be our opening practice, embracing hopelessness. The image on the screen before you was taken by a Palestinian photographer. This is an image of destruction in Gaza. And wherever you find yourself, in whatever nation you're coming from tonight, and however your politics tend to impact your perspectives on global issues, I want to invite you into the humanity of this image tonight. And to imagine the scripture that we just read from the Doctrine and Covenants. And imagine God present and weeping even here. Let's take a few moments now to engage in some personal reflection. When have you felt truly hopeless in your life? When were you in a Good Friday or Holy Saturday moment? Take a few moments to very gently notice what arises for you now. What feels hopeless at this time? Stay present with the feeling for just a few moments tonight. Trust that God is with you, even in the feeling of hopelessness. And finally, if we were together, I would invite us to take some time to go write our prayers of lament. If we were at a camp, I would say, go sit by the lake or under your favorite tree, or find that spot for you where you can simply reflect and open a space to listen to the Spirit, to write a prayer of lament as you hold the feeling of hopelessness and the reality of suffering in our world even now. Noticing how God meets us in this place. So we are not going to take time to do that tonight, but if you're feeling stirred to explore this practice, maybe this is something that you return to after our session together. Writing prayers of lament can be a powerful way to enact our biblical ancestors, to stay present to reality as it is, and to express our genuine feelings with God in prayer, trusting that God is with us in whatever we are experiencing. So in the reunion text, we return again to some words from Jeff Spencer. And Stacy introduced us to two words last week, futurum and adventus. And futurum refers to the continuation of events into the future, more of a linear perspective of what will or may unfold, while adventus is the breaking in of God's presence in our reality in the here and now that opens new possibilities of futures beyond our imagination of what is possible. And so Jeff Spencer says, Christian hope is the conviction that the totality of our lives and of the human family and history exist by the promise of God. All of our history is sacred history because all of our history has taken place in the presence and reality of God with us through every generation, every moment throughout time. If it were not for this horizon of expectation, then we might well be totally immobilized, unable to live with any sense of assurance in the present moment, and devoid of any faith in the trustworthiness of the future. He goes on to say, the question we ask, along with planners and futurists, is, when will justice, freedom, peace, and dignity happen if they happen at all? Yet for Christians, this is not the question. There is also always the future, Adventus, which comes toward us from God as a promise. In relation to the Adventus, our question is not, when will it happen, if ever, but how can we live now as if the horizon of that future had already broken into our lives through the Spirit of Jesus Christ? The discovery of this new horizon of freedom leads us to actions because God hopes for us, and it is up to us to live now as if the form of this world is passing away and the new creation is already present in our lives. Wow, there is a lot to unpack there. And I wish that we could take the next hour just to hear your thoughts about what this stirs in you as you discern how to be a faithful disciple amid the complex, challenging times in which we live today. I know that many often feel a sense of immobilization in the midst of the tremendous pressures, the systemic injustices that feel almost impossible to impact in any way. And yet, what Jeff Spencer is saying to us is that as Christians, we're not asking if this future of our hopes is ever going to happen, but how is it already happening? Where are the places where God's vision, love, justice, peace, hope, shalom are already breaking in among us in our daily lives and relationships, communities, and contexts? And how can we live now as if that vision were real? Just imagine for a moment if you were to live now as if the kingdom of God were among us. What might change in your daily attitudes, actions, and behaviors? And this is a form of hope. In fact, liberation ethicist Miguel de la Torre says that the function of utopian vision is to guide praxis. The function of utopian vision is to guide praxis. It's not to sit and have wishful thinking that everything's going to turn out okay, but to live in this time, in this moment, in this context, in the here and now of wherever we are, with a hope and vision and conviction of God's presence and reality among us. Jeff Spencer goes on to say, hope brings us the conviction that there is an unfinished element to our lives. Rebecca Solnit says, when we're thinking about the future, we're fearing often what we think will happen, but hope lives in that none of the things we fear have happened yet. And that's what Jeff Spencer is saying here too. Hope brings us the conviction that there is an unfinished element to our lives. The future is still open. Reality can still be shaped and formed in powerful ways by our lives and actions in cooperation with the liberating Spirit of God. This is true whether we refer to the life of an individual, the community of faith, of the whole human family, and the entire family of creation. So, as Letty Russell indicates, we live now as if those unfinished chapters of history are already shaping up to appear. Moreover, we are prompted to believe that the unfinished part is at least as significant as the part of our experience that we already know. The past is but prologue to the future. It should be noticed here that people who have opted for hope function out of perspective so naturally that it is difficult for them to imagine any other way of existing. They will continue to confront the future with assurance, even in the face of events and circumstances that might appear to others to be of such a magnitude as to crush or devastate the human spirit. I kind of feel like we just need to hold that last sentence in our hearts for a minute or a year or however long it takes to strengthen our own spiritual resolve. They will continue to confront the future with assurance, even in the face of events and circumstances that might appear to others to be of such a magnitude as to crush or devastate the human spirit. And so again, if we were together, I would invite your reflection. I mean, we are together. I should acknowledge that we are together here in this form, in this place, and we will have opportunity to share questions and reflections at the end of this session. But if we were in person in a reunion setting, I would love to hear all your thoughts. How do you experience the difference between futurum, the future just continuing to unfold, and Adventus, the breaking in of God's vision, presence, hope, and possibility? How can we live now as if the horizon of that future had already broken into our lives through the Spirit of Jesus Christ? And what does it mean for you to confront the future with assurance? So, questions for you to continue to ponder. So throughout this reunion material, the gift that we have from Luther Smith's book, Hope is Here, is that he offers us 5 practices for sustaining the work of hope in our lives. And I recognize that we all are made up of different spiritual preferences and types. We have different ways of connecting and relating to the divine presence. And so some of these practices may resonate more strongly than others, but I think all of them held together offer us an integrated way of enacting and sustaining the work of hope in our lives. And so last week we talked about prophetic remembering, calling upon our own cloud of witnesses. Who are those powerful people from our history of faith and from our own personal spiritual lives who continue to be sources of wisdom and guidance for us as we face the present and the future? Tonight, we're going to be talking about contemplative praying, and I'm going to give us just a little taste of contemplative prayer. So in his book, Luther Smith says, within us is a God-given resource, the authentic self, that heals and empowers us to live in the present and future with confidence and hopefulness. We are wise to listen for it. The listening heart is not only assured and guided by one's own authentic self, the heart listens for the God who dwells in others. I'll also make note that in the reunion materials, there are several video references that are optional. They are optional because they are only in English, and this reunion material is used in French and Spanish as well. But even if you're a French or Spanish speaker, if you go to YouTube and watch the videos of Luther Smith, you can change the captions so that you can have translated what he is saying. And if we had more time tonight, I'd love for you to hear more of Luther in his own words. But just know that if you have a desire to continue to deepen in your reflection, those resources are also available for you. So from the reunion text, we read, "Contemplative praying is prayer with a listening and open heart. Often the fruit of a few minutes of silent listening with God doesn't ripen in us until we've engaged in consistent practice over time. It is not an instant gratification prayer. It doesn't always lead to the feelings of prayer we have come to associate with the presence of God. It is a prayer that deepens our trust in the presence of God amid whatever we are feeling." And if you think about everything we've talked about so far, right? This is the kernel of wisdom. It is a prayer that deepens our trust in the presence of God amid whatever we are feeling. I know sometimes when we come to prayer, we kind of feel like if we don't have that special, warm, peaceful God feeling, that either the prayer didn't work or we did something wrong or wasn't the right prayer for us. But contemplative praying is about being present in reality as it is. In fact, another common definition is that it invites us to take a long, loving look at the real, trusting that God is present in the real of wherever we are. And I can't think of a more powerful prayer form to strengthen our spirits in the contexts in which we live in the world today. So continuing in the text, the gift of contemplative prayer is that we begin to sense our own inward center, in the words of Howard Thurman. There is within each of us an amazing inner sanctuary of soul, a holy place, a divine center, a speaking voice to which we may continuously return. And this God-given resource is a space from which we can respond to the events of our lives and contexts from an inward stability and integrity in the spirit as our most authentic self. Oops, I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. So what I'd like to invite us to do tonight is to just take 1 minute of silence. I know that for some, 1 minute of silence can feel like way too much. And for others, 1 minute of silence is not even close to enough. But in the midst of all the things that are swirling around and within us right now, I want to invite you to just take a few moments tonight to encounter your own inward center, that inner sanctuary of the soul, where God doesn't need you to feel a particular way or to show up in a particular condition, but God is with you as you are in whatever you are feeling as you come tonight. So I invite you to take a few moments now to settle in wherever you are coming from. Draw your attention gently to your breath. And we're going to spend just 1 minute in silence to listen deeper as we enter that inner sanctuary of the soul. Draw your attention again to your breathing. And return your awareness to this gathered community here tonight. It was just 1 minute of silence. Notice for a moment, what was it like to just be? Was it noisy inside, or was it calm? Did you feel the clamor of the many things pressing for your attention? Or did a more profound invitation or spaciousness begin to open up within you? Again, if we were in a reunion class experience, the next thing we would do is spend a little bit more time in silence through 5 minutes of centering prayer, where we would use a sacred word to anchor us and just continue to practice that being with God as a source of sustaining the work of hope in us. And again, I invite you to just reflect, what was this time of prayer like for you, even though it was very brief tonight? How can your inward center or sanctuary sustain the work of hope in your life? How might contemplative praying be an act of resistance and hope? So, as always, there's way more to talk about than we have time for, but hopefully this gave you a taste of the core of this session from the reunion materials. As we sat in the place of hopelessness, remembering that genuine Christian hope has to be grounded in Good Friday and Holy Saturday for the authentic experience of resurrection. We engaged in the invitation of lament as a practice of our biblical ancestors. We reflected on God's hope breaking into our lives in the spirit of Adventists, and imagined what would it be like to live now as if that horizon were already breaking in among us in the spirit of Jesus Christ. And we spent a little time deepening in our inward sanctuary as a practice of sustaining the work of hope in turbulent times. And so now I'm going to close by offering us a reflection from ecological theologian Sally McFaig. She says, God keeps all things. A new morning springs, the resurrection occurs. In the worst of times, people often say, all we have is God. Indeed, here God is the thread of hope that desperate people hold on to. God is that scrap of life and goodness still in us. God is whatever keeps us from giving up. God is not a being, but whatever life or love there is, no matter how small. We hold on to whatever shred of hope is left. It is very small indeed sometimes, but it is enough. Amen. Thank you for your time and attention tonight. I'm going to turn things back over to David, and I'm happy to continue to explore and answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Katie. That was really, really good. I think I like how this is turning in the formation of what the every day of the week class is during the reunion sessions. Here we are on the second day, and we're talking about the importance of hope as being some place in the midst of hopelessness. That it's Friday but Sunday's coming idea. We seem to be stuck in our culture in many ways in a state of hopelessness. The church isn't what it used to be. Politics aren't what they used to be. Life isn't what it used to be. And we get that heaped upon us so much that to hear you say that we know some form of hopelessness is where we need to be in order to take the time to lament. And I think that's a good place to start, and a difficult place to start, because we don't like to dwell in that place of lament so much. So how do you see that being in the place of hopelessness brings us to a place of hope?
Yeah, thanks, David. That's a great question. First, I just want to say that my heart moves with a sense of like, um, be gentle with your spirits, everyone. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
I think this is really hard work. This is really hard inner work for disciples to come up against the limits of our own capacities for staying present with what is. But there's something really powerful. I mean, first of all, God is a God of radical solidarity. And so, as we are in solidarity with the suffering of our world, we are embodying the heart of God's love and presence. And so, I think there is something about being in the places where we know that God is present and weeping with us, that when we also enter those places, those are often the places where genuine movements of hope are actually birthed. I don't
right,
think we can get to genuine Christian hope if we are not willing to be with reality as it is. Then we are just imposing some fantasy of hope on something that we're not really willing to take the time to know or understand or be present with. And so when we can
right.
sit in those places and deepen our capacity for being present to the world as it is, those are actually the very places where God's Spirit is breaking in with possibilities, um, for hope and redemption and reconciliation.
Right. And many times I don't think we recognize that we're stuck in hopelessness. That and I think that's where the Adventist part comes in, the question of then how do we live now? And like in most Christian theology, it's not so much about how we try to change others, but it's how we try to change ourselves, how we let God bring change into our own lives that develop us. So how do we best turn toward finding hope in our own selves?
Yeah. Are you asking?
Yeah, yes, I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I really value about this reunion material is the 5 practices that Luther Smith outlines. The prophetic remembering, we sustain that hope in us by calling on our ancestors, which is a practice that's much more common outside of Western Christianity, but is important for us to embrace. We sustain the work of hope by entering the sanctuary of the soul, by being present with God and listening in a deeper way, creating the space to hear God's voice amid the many competing voices and demands for our attention that are present in our lives and world today. And then I think you'll see through the rest of these sessions, I think it's next week is crossing identity boundaries, which is really paying attention to what are those parts of my own identity that are really important, and how do I honor and respect the parts of other people's identities so that we can live in diverse community together. We also talk about transforming conflict and celebrating community. And so there's this really beautiful kind of, in our language, spiraling inward outward dimension of sustaining hope, that it's both deeply personal and deeply communal. And all of that is so important for us to cultivate those inner resources for our time.
Absolutely. Yes. And Gwendolyn asks us a question closely tied to that. As we work to be in the space of Adventists, how do we also work for justice? Is Adventist reflected in how we approach working for justice?
Yes. I think that they can't be separated. And so if we imagine, and I think last week Stacy quoted Luther Smith in saying, God's dream for us is hope's purpose. God's dream for us is hope's purpose. And so as we are encountering that inbreaking of the Spirit of Jesus Christ and the realities of our lives, it's always moving us in the direction of God's larger preferred vision for all creation of wholeness, justice, reconciliation, shalom. And if we are enacting that vision in the present, that always includes an element of justice and peacemaking.
Yes. Well, let's move from the ethereal to more concrete. Kathy Baker, who I know is a reunion director in the past, asked the question, Hi, Katie, if you were creating a worship center for the daily themes, such as Breathe in Hope, what might you use?
Oh, that's a great question. Thanks, Kathy. I honestly just want to pull up the worship resources because I'm sure there are suggestions in there, and it's been a while since I looked at them. So I would encourage you to go to Herald House and see what suggestions you might find in those resources. I am not always great at the creative, like how to put together a worship setting, but I would imagine I would focus on symbols of solidarity, especially as we're talking about engaging the practice of lament.
Good. Right. Claudia asked to know the difference between hope and expectation. Some degree of letting go might be needed. Hopelessness might factor in.
Yes, I really just want to hear more. I just want to talk to Claudia for an hour about that because I think she
Yeah,
has wisdom to share too. But yeah, certainly there's an element of letting go of our resistance, letting go of our discomfort, letting go of our own assumptions and narratives that sometimes keep us from being present to reality in the ways that we need to.
indeed. Darcy asks, Katie, I see that many of the people you quoted are in the reunion material. Are there others you quoted that are not named in the material? Are there other books or authors you recommend to explore that on hope?
Yes. So another person I quoted, and I think he may be quoted in the material too, is Miguel de la Torre. He has a couple really powerful books. One is Doing Christian Ethics from the Margins, that has been a really formative book in my life. And the other, I actually think the title of his book is Embracing Hopelessness. And he's really, talking from kind of a ethicist's perspective about, how do you talk about hope with some of the poorest of the poor, some of the most oppressed of the earth, whose conditions will not get better? What does Christian hope mean for the people who are experiencing famine and starvation right now? What does Christian hope mean for people who are actively in a war zone? And so he really explores what it looks like to go deep into hopelessness and solidarity. And that's a really hard but important read. There's also, I mentioned the book Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit, where she kind of shares different stories of movements of hope throughout time. There's also a really great collection of essays called The Impossible Will Take a While, which has become a source of hope for me. I could go on and on. You probably don't want to hear me list books all night, but yeah, there's some really, really good stuff out there. I would also say Jesus is a good source for hope. I feel like I should throw that in too.
All of his healings were based on people who were hopeless and surprised by the hope that he provided. Also, the responsibility after the healing that people would have to go through. We don't talk about that enough, is that it changed their lives not only physically, but also from their aspect of what they do with the rest of their lives once they're healed. Yeah, important.
Yeah, I do also just want to say, David, that I feel like a lot of this material has been um, really deeply impacted by liberation theology voices.
Yes.
And I think that that's a really deeply important perspective for the church to understand those deeper dimensions of Christian hope, especially in the midst of, as Jeff Spencer said, those conditions that can crush the human spirit. And so Howard Thurman in particular, Howard Thurman was a professor, writer, mystic who deeply influenced the writings of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the United States. And his writings are so powerful about sustaining the human spirit in the midst of difficult conditions, systemically and personally in life. And so any book you pick up by Howard Thurman is going to be well worth the read.
Yes. So Paul asks, it says from South Central States Mission Center is looking to offer a silent retreat. Jumped up there in September, and would love to offer material that could be used in the context of a weekend of silence, maybe crossing paths to discuss. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Paul, we'll talk.
Good.
I'm sure Paul has good material too. So
Sure. Mark asked, this appears to be the start from the proposition that each of us is in a position of hopelessness. Does the good news of Jesus assume that we should be in a position of hopelessness?
That's a good question, Mark. I would say we probably all come to this call tonight in different states, right? Some of us might legitimately be in a place of hopelessness. Some of us may be far from that. And so it's really not about trying to be in a place you're not, but about practicing recognizing God in whatever place you are. And the element of, solidarity and recognizing that our lives are connected with each other is to say we're willing to be with others in their places of hopelessness too. And by being present with others in their hopelessness, we're embodying the presence and solidarity of God, but we also become more acquainted with the realities in which possibilities for hope can emerge. So I would say it's not about, all of us need to feel hopeless, but we have to be willing to encounter hopelessness to be able to get to genuine Christian hope.
Yeah.
I hope that answers that.
Well, and Susan brings a little word of hope here. We had been in a hopeless situation in our congregation. We know that COVID has not bothered our congregation. We have doubled in our congregation with 2 new members in a new baptism. So we find hope in the midst of hopelessness as we continue, and a lot of times it's not the way we expected it to be. So I have another one here. Katie, if you were asked between personal and communal hope, which one should we learn which one should we learn the most? Can one be seen to be more embracing than the other in our complex world? And he's from Liberia.
Yeah. Hi, Goba. Um, GA is a member of the World Church Spiritual Formation team, actually. So I'm sure he has some great perspective to bring too. I think it's really hard to separate the personal and the communal. I think we show up better in community when we're willing to do the inner work personally. I think that both sustain each other. And I know there are some cultures that tend to focus on the individual at the expense of the communal, and other cultures tend to focus on the communal at the expense of the individual. But I really think that finding a good balance between the two is an important part of cultivating the work of hope in us. So I don't know, I don't know how that feels to you. But again, I'd love to just be in more dialogue about all of these great questions.
Great. So you ended with contemplative prayer. Uh, there, it's wonderful to use that in a setting like a reunion, especially where you have a place where you can nature gaze and get away from the things at home that might be distracting you, or even in church that might distract you in that. But I know that spiritual practices are a very important part of your ministry. So how can we use like uh, this kind of a prayer in our own personal spiritual development?
Hmm. Um, well, I'm always really cautious to be too prescriptive about people's
Mm,
prayer lives because I know that we're all different. We all connect in different ways. And that's okay and good. I do think that what Luther Smith is saying about contemplative prayer in his book, especially as he holds it in connection with those other practices that are a combination of very inward and outward focused, um, is that we all need time and space in our lives to listen in a deeper way. And that might be a formal practice of centering prayer. It might be a walk in nature. It might be whatever brings a sense of quieting to your spirit to be able to discern the voice of God amid the many voices that are clamoring for our attention in the world today. And so, for example, if you're hearing, if the I know this is kind of a weird phrase for us to use, but if all the voices in your head are like news pundits and things happening in the world, then it might be time to turn off the TV and take a few moments of silence to settle into that deeper inward center and say, God, where are you in this? What do you want me to hear? And I think that's just a core practice of discipleship. Whether you're engaging in a 20-minute period of centering prayer with your sacred word, or whether you are just driving on the road and turn off the radio and choose to create the space in your life to be attentive to the divine movement and voice that can be that source of hope and conviction and assurance in whatever it is that we're facing.
wonderful. Thank you so much, Katie, for engaging with us tonight. Day two, I think we could spend the whole week on this one topic and spiritual formation of how we look at finding hope in our lives and in our church and in our communities. Join us next week as the other part of the Harmon-McLaughlin family. Zach will be joining us as our speaker for day three, and we hope you all can join us then. Until then, thank you for joining us on Sim Sessions. We'll see you at the next time.